Thank you, Howard. I'm really pleased to be holding this event as we continue our celebrations of cultural diversity as a business and as part of Black History Month in the UK. The purpose of our One Westcon programme, which hopefully you're all familiar with, is really to build on our diverse workforce and drive inclusion and a sense of belonging for our current employees and our future employees. Through this programme, we strive to create an environment where we value and develop employees of all backgrounds. And by broadening our understanding and sharing each other's experiences in events like this and through our ERGs, we can create a true sense of community in our workforce. So it's a real honour to have David join us today to share his knowledge with us of how Black, African and Caribbean people have shaped our history in Britain. These stories aren't only of interest or relevance to Black people, they do belong to us all, whatever our skin colour. We're standing on their shoulders in some way as we aspire to evolve further to fulfil our potential both individually and as a nation. Before we hear from David, Anthony Byford, who unfortunately couldn't join us live on the event today, he has still shared some thoughts though about Black History Month and why it's so important to him.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Anthony Byford. For starters, it isn't just a month. Black History Month represents and highlights the struggles many face daily and what some still face today. The tragic death of George Floyd brought into sharp focus the silent battles our Black friends, colleagues and family members have endured for years and have been dismissed by the view that slavery is just an historical thing that we should just all get over. My personal Black friends have told me that being Black means having to explain to generations gone and generations to come that they must work harder to be recognised, seen or recognised as successful because of their skin colour, race or even their name. Being Black means knowing your white counterparts have had a head start in life, yet expect you to compete equally in the race of life. For me, this is just wrong. No matter your heritage, race, colour, or where your religious beliefs come and reside, the race of life only becomes successful for all of us when there's a sense of inclusion. What makes you better than someone else just because they might be different to you? Isn't that what makes life interesting and easier? Diverse communities and love for all? This is the same love that a Black doctor in Kingston Hospital gave me at the age of 2 weeks old back in 1977, who performed a life-saving operation. He made the decision to try something different and ensured I had a future. The scar I carry on my chest reminds me every day how grateful and lucky I am to him. For countless generations, people of African and Caribbean descent have been shaping our nation's history. It is a fact that our nation has always been influenced by the presence of different races and nationalities and their undeniable contribution to our culture and economy. During Black History Month, we tell the stories of those who we will forget if we don't showcase them. Where people have been excluded, it is right that we highlight them so that their valuable contributions to the evolution are no longer forgotten or overlooked. Walter Toll, from 1908, he took a storm to football. He played for Clapham FC, then following many years at Tottenham Hotspur. When the First World War hit, Toll gave up his sporting career and enlisted. He had a successful career fighting in France. Claudia Jones, she was born in Trinidad in 1915 and in 1955 gained asylum in the UK, where she launched Britain's first major Black newspaper, the West Indian Gazette. Confronted by no blacks, no dogs, no Irish posters, Jones became a leader in the emerging Black equal rights movement, and in 1959 she helped found the Notting Hill Carnival, with the hopes that showcasing Caribbean culture and heritage would empower her community. Jones died at 49, leaving quite a legacy. The Notting Hill Carnival is the biggest carnival, street festival, should I say, in Europe. Dr. Oliver Lysite, he migrated to England from Jamaica in 1951, was the founder of one of Britain's largest Black majority churches, and was a spiritual leader to the Windrush generation, the first Caribbeans to emigrate in significant numbers to post-war Britain, notably in 1948, on HMT Empire Windrush. And to close this off, I wanted to close it off with a statement from a megastar, Beyonce. She says, to all those who feel different, if you're part of a group that's called other, a group that does not get the chance to be centre stage, build your own centre stage and make them see you. Your queerness is beautiful. Your blackness is beautiful. Your compassion, your understanding, your fight for people who may be different from you. It's beautiful. I hope you continue to go into the world and show them that you will never stop being yourself. That is your time now. Make them see you. Thanks for listening.
And thank you, Anthony. And what an amazing and very insightful interpretation of what Black History Month or Black History means to Anthony, and I guess to all of you as well. So, broadcaster, historian, lecturer, and author, David Olusoga, welcome to the call. It's an absolute pleasure to meet you. We've just under an hour to run through, I guess, a few questions that we've got from the group, but also I've got one key question that I'd like to perhaps kick off proceedings and let you talk, I guess, for the first 30 minutes or so, just to give us an insight into perhaps, well, what can you tell us about the impact and importance of diverse culture and how Black people have challenged but continued to make a huge impact in society and the world of work today. David, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think when we think about a pivotal event in the story of Black Britain, the arrival of the Windrush, which is often mistaken as the beginning, the origin story of Black Britain, when we think about that event, I think we sometimes miss out a key element of it, a key factor that drove it. The Windrush came about for all sorts of reasons. But the force that really drove people to come to Britain, the force that was at the absolute heart of those decisions, those entrepreneurial decisions to come to Britain, was the determination to work. Black people came to Britain after the Second World War, along with other migrants, out of a determination, absolute clear determination, to be part of the workforce. The act of emigration is in itself an act of entrepreneurialism. To transport yourself across an ocean, to pay for your passage, to find work, to take the enormous risks of being a migrant is about work betterment, improvement. It involves rebuilding your family an ocean away, often taking a decade to do so. At the heart of this is a story that is about work and about the work ethic. In 1948, the British government desperately, and I'm sad to say the government of Clement Attlee, otherwise a rather remarkable man, that government desperately attempted to prevent the people on board the Windrush from coming to Britain. They attempted to prevent the ship from leaving the Caribbean. When it was at sea, the government, our government, a British government, attempted to divert the Windrush to East Africa, where the people on board were supposed to be given jobs in the infamous, financially disastrous groundnut scheme, an attempt to grow peanuts in East Africa in order to produce cooking oil for Britain. When that didn't work, the British government had no choice but to allow the Windrush and the 492 people on board to dock in Tilbury. And that moment of arrival was welcomed not by the government, but by business. Indeed, the government was so unhappy about the arrival of migrants, the beginning of non-white migration to Britain after the Second World War, that the people on the Windrush were housed literally underground, as if they were a secret. They were kept in the deep air raid shelter of Clapham South underground station that was reopened to accommodate them. But as I said, if the government didn't want them, well, industry clearly did, because within a month, all of them had work, and the rest were hard at work trying to find jobs. And one of the reasons they found work so quickly is because they'd come to Britain to work, and they had exactly the skills that Britain in 1948 needed. On board that single ship was 85 mechanics, 54 carpenters, 39 clerks, 23 engineers, 20 welders, 15 machinists, 14 fitters, 13 electricians, 12 civil servants, 10 shoemakers, 3 boxers, 2 piano repairers, 2 hairdressers, a potter, a hatter, and the Trinidadian calypso singer, Lord Kitchener. And these people, with these skills, they arrived in a Britain that was effectively bankrupt, a nation in which there was rationing, a nation in which there were constant shortages, and a nation in which there was a desperate, colossal shortage of labour. The British government estimated at the end of the Second World War that the need for labour stood at 1.3 million additional hands needed to rebuild, needed to repair the country after the war. That nation desperately short of labour, was in no position to be anything other than economically grateful for the arrival of the people on the Windrush and their skills. They spoke English, they carried British passports, they were in many ways culturally very British. There were no bureaucratic hurdles. They had full legal rights to enter the country and to work here, so they could arrive on the ship one day, be at work the next day, helping rebuild the nation. Indeed, some of the new arrivals on the Windrush already had jobs, and they already had accommodation lined up, or they were coming to rejoin the armed services, because a great many of them were veterans of the Second World War. They should have been welcomed with open arms by the government. What made this controversial, what made it an issue that was to rumble on for decades, was the issue of race. These were the people who Britain needed, but they were the wrong colour. And so this story of Britain's creation, the emergence of a black British population, is one that needs to be understood as one in which people moved here in order to improve their lives and work. And yet, so convinced were British governments of the racial stereotypes that had emerged in the 18th and the 19th centuries that claimed falsely that black people did not want to work, that claimed falsely that black people lacked industry and drive, that they were chaotic and disorganized. All of those stereotypes, the government was so convinced of them that British governments in the 40s and 50s asked British police forces to spy on the early black communities to try to find evidence of their indolence, their laziness, try to find evidence that people who got on ships at huge expense in order to find jobs were seeking social security. This speaks to the power of the idea of race and how those stereotypes have got really nothing to do with the real history of black people in Britain. Because the people on the Windrush who were arriving in the late 40s and then the ships that came afterwards in the 50s and 60s, they were just the latest chapter in a longer story. And it's astonishing to me to think that the 492 people who came on the Windrush were unaware of the long history of the black presence in Britain itself. They didn't know when they built their lives in cities like London, Liverpool and Bristol that there had been homes, those cities had been homes to previous generations of black Victorians. They didn't know it because the books literally hadn't been written. The documents lay in the archives, forgotten about, unexamined by historians. And the black people we know from the past who are absolutely part of our experience, part of our national story today, many of them are forgotten about. Their memoirs were out of print. Their portraits had been miscatalogued, pushed to one side. Had that history been available to the black communities of the 40s and 50s, the Windrush generation, the original Windrush generation, what would it have meant to them? What strength might they have drawn from the fact that they were part of a longer continuum, a longer tradition? Black Londoners who made their homes in the capital in the 40s and 50s, they were making their homes in the same city as John Blank, who arrived in 1509, 5 centuries almost earlier. He arrived in the entourage of Catherine of Aragon, who came to marry not Henry VIII, but Henry's older brother Arthur, who then died, and Catherine became Henry's bride. We know about John Blank. His name, John Blank, is a Tudor humour, we suspect. John White, for a man who was black. This is an individual whose voice we can hear from the archives, whose presence in Britain is recorded in the Royal Archives, receipts for the purchase of clothes for him to take part in royal events, a letter to Henry VIII, demanding a pay rise which he received, a letter from Henry VIII promising to buy him a wedding gift when he married a white Englishwoman. This is a black Londoner from 500 years ago, half a millennia ago. That history, that important history that creates a sense of belonging, a sense of place, that history had just become lost. Up until the 1960s, there was one chapter in one book about black British history. That's all there was. So the work of recovering this history, re-establishing it, rebuilding it, making it part of the national story, that's been the work of a different half a century. Since the 1960s, more and more books have been written at a slow pace, but a pace that hopefully is about to increase with the flurry of new books currently being written or published. But the recovery of black history, the finding of those documents, the rebuilding of those forgotten lives, that's only half the story. The other half of the story is how the black community and their allies in this country have made that history part part of the mainstream, how they've written this history into the story of the nation. And that history, at the centre of it, is the thing that we're talking about today, well, the thing we're celebrating today, I should say, which is Black History Month. It's odd that one of the things we don't talk about in Black History Month is the history of Black History Month. And yet, I think it's a really important story to tell. Black History Month is an American import. It was born in 1926 as Negro History Week. And the idea was created by Carter G. Woodson, the African-American historian. In 1970, it became Black History Month. And then in 1987, it made the leap across the Atlantic and came to Britain, but in a very modest, very small way. The first Black History Month was celebrated only in London, only in the Greater London Council, indeed. And anybody who'd been at one of those early Black History Month events in the late 80s or the early 90s could not have dreamed that it would become what it is today. Because what it is today is part of the culture, part of the calendar, part of the expectations of thousands of companies and corporations, of institutions, of schools, of charities. Black History Month is the mechanism by which black people, a very small minority, 3.3% of the population, around 2 million people, have taken a history that had to be recovered and re-established, built from fragments scattered across archives across the country. They've taken that history and made it part of the national story. When I was growing up, the Windrush meant nothing. Today, everyone knows what the Windrush means. So that achievement of inscribing Black history back onto the national story, that's something I think we need to absolutely celebrate in Black History Month. But I think there's more. There's something else that we need to do. It's an astonishing success, Black History Month, but much of what it talks about, much of what Black History Month is about stories that we would have to define as stories of contribution. And this is a big part of my work, and it's absolutely vital part of history, and it's not something that I would ever denigrate or deny. But the problem is that's not all of Black history. The contribution version of Black history rightly reminds us that there were black sailors at the Battle of Trafalgar, 123 men who came from the Caribbean, 18 men who came from Africa. We can see their names, their ages, where they were born, how much they were paid, the role they played on those ships that went to war with Nelson. We can see them in art. We can see them in paintings in Parliament. We can see them in the base of Nelson's column, where one of the depictions in the bas-relief shows a black sailor who fought under Nelson. Vitally important story to remind ourselves that black people played roles in these pivotal events in British history. This form of black history about contributions tells us that there were black soldiers who fought in the First World War, many of them stowing away on ships to reach England in order to join the army. An intervention was needed from the king to create a regiment dedicated to allowing them to fight for Britain. This same form of black history that celebrates contributions also reminds us of the thousands of women, very young women for the most part, who left their homes after the Second World War to become nurses in our NHS. The NHS simply could not have operated, could not have become a truly national health service without those thousands of women from the Caribbean and some from Africa who flocked to the service and made it what it is. This history of black contributions is absolutely vital to reframing British history, to threading through the British story, the forgotten chapters, the deliberately erased chapters about the lives and the contributions and the role of black people. The problem is there's two sorts of black history. There's another sort that I think Black History Month is now mature enough and big enough to actually incorporate also. Because the other form of black history is to remember what it is that black people have been fighting against for all of these centuries. And that is the idea of race, the stereotypes, the ideas of racial hierarchy, the concepts of inferiority and superiority that were invented in the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. Those ideas, those stereotypes are the basis of structural forms of racism. Because race is structural because it was constructed, it was built, it was engineered, it has architects, it has authors. Race was built to justify slavery and the slave trade and to defend those trades when they were under attack from abolitionists. racism was then repurposed, reimagined, and used to justify and defend imperialism. And when I say this idea was built, it was built over centuries and vast amounts of money. Millions of hours of human effort and human ingenuity were poured into creating the stereotypes that were used to justify both slavery and empire. And those stereotypes, fragments of them, still operate in our society today. Ideas about the nature, about the capabilities, about the supposed incapabilities of black people and other people of colour became almost ubiquitous. They appear in thousands of official documents. They appear in thousands of novels and plays. They were transmitted to our society through millions of images, through children's books, through forms of entertainment, through animation, through cinema. The most popular form of entertainment in Britain, as well as America, in the North of America, in the late second half of the 19th century, was not musical, it was blackface minstrelsy. And the inventor of blackface minstrelsy, a form of racial impersonation, a form of racial lampooning, Thomas D. Rice, was very clear that he'd invented these corruptions of black music and black dance forms in order to prove to his audiences, both in America and in the United Kingdom, that black people were inferior, that black people were deficient, that black people were incapable of behaviours, of dignity, of intelligence, all the things, the stereotypes invented by the slave-owning lobby had said for decades. We need to recognise that these ideas that were drafted by men who've been in their graves for centuries, they're not just things that you encounter if you read books from the past. It's not just of concern to historians, because these ideas operate in our society. Let me give you an example. One of the most common ideas that was put forward by the slave-owning lobbies of the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries was that black people have a different physiological relationship with pain to white people. Now, these ideas that black people have a lower pain threshold, higher pain threshold, that they can experience things that they would not regard as pain that a white person would regard as pain. These ideas were pushed forward energetically and powerfully by the slave owners, not just in the British Empire, but the French Empire, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and in the United States and the Dutch Empire. These ideas about the physiological nature of black people, used to justify the violence of the slave system, were common. But it's not just that they were common then, they still exist today. We can locate and we can quantify how these ideas about human difference have a material impact upon the lives of people today. The example of pain is really important because numerous studies in America and in Europe have demonstrated that doctors, the best people in our society, people who've committed themselves to the care of their fellow creatures, the doctors subconsciously, regularly underrate and underprescribe the pain of black patients relative to white patients. The disparity in pain perception among clinicians is so wide that the pain of black patients is underrated relative not just to white patients, but sometimes relative to the WHO guidelines. As a result, black people right now are receiving less pain relief than white people, even for fractures. This is also something that applies to black children whose pain is also underrated when they present at hospital to white doctors. The idea that accounts for this, that explains why we might make this subconscious presumption that black people feel pain differently, those ideas can be traced back directly to the ideas of doctors in past centuries. In the British imperial context, one of those doctors is Benjamin Moseley, who in the middle of the 18th century came to the island of Jamaica. There he rose to become the Surgeon General of that island. And he studied not just the island, he studied the black people, the enslaved people who lived there. And he wrote up his conclusions in a book called A Treatise on Tropical Diseases and the Climate of the West Indies. And it's one of the places where we see these myths, these untruths about the nature of pain and black people. He claimed that black people were void of sensibility to a surprising degree. But sensibility is merely an 18th century way of saying sensitivity. They are, Moseley said, not subject to nervous diseases. They sleep soundly in every disease, no matter how ill they are, nor does any mental disturbance ever keep them awake. Moseley even argued something which was repeated in books written by doctors, written by supposed race scientists in multiple contexts in different empires across the world. Moseley argued that black people could bear operations, so they could tolerate surgery much better than white people. And what he called pain that was insupportable to a white man, he said, a Negro would almost disregard. He even, and again, this is a claim that is repeated time and again in book after book from empire to empire, he even claimed to have operated surgically upon black people who were able to hold the top of the limb that was being operated upon. This myth that black people do not feel pain in the way that white people can be seen from a book 100 years later, so a century later, a book by a man called John Brown, an enslaved man who escaped slavery in Georgia, came to Britain and became an abolitionist. John Brown wrote about being the victim of medical experiments designed to try to prove that black people had thicker skins, as that was said to be the mechanism by which they were less vulnerable to pain. And we can see the same ideas half a century later in the work of Charles Mangin, who was the French imperial racial theorist, who in 1910 wrote a book called La Force Noire, the Black Army. And Mangin helped persuade the French government that black colonial soldiers, men from the French empires in Africa, should be used in fighting in any future European war. And part of his argument for this was that black people, he said, have a disregard for pain. He claimed, with absolutely no evidence, that black people could be, again, the same myth, operated upon without anesthetics. Mangin argued that black people have an underdeveloped nervous system, and in some way this enabled them to withstand the shock of battle, which rendered them immune to post-traumatic stress disorder. And he said that black people had intellectual abilities so low that they could not calculate their chances of surviving in any combat situation, and therefore were not stressed by the idea of impending combat. These ideas that you can trace through books of the British, and American and French experience from the 18th century to the early 20th century, these ideas are still with us. We know about the levels of differential and disparative prescription of pain relief in hospitals in Europe and America. Researchers have even revealed that black people themselves tend to believe these ideas, that they've imbibed these stereotypes about themselves. And one study by Dorr et al. In 2014 showed that when white and minority ethnic children were shown pictures of black children and white children and asked to estimate how much pain they might feel in various situations, these children reported that black people would feel less pain than white people. These ideas are so powerful that people have imbibed them by the age of 7. We have other examples of ideas from the past that live on in our society that make the study of this history all the more important. The racial ideas that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries said that black people had qualities, but those qualities were physical. Black people were of the body. White people were said to be of the mind. Today, in sports commentary across Europe, it is far more likely, as studies by Run Repeats, the charity, have shown, for black players to be described using physical attributes. Black players are far more likely, 6.59 times more likely, to be described as athletic, tough, physical, things about their body. And white players are much more likely, 3.38 times more likely, to be described using attributes about their mind, their intelligence. They're far more likely to be described as tactical or strategic or intelligent than black players. Again, these ideas, these notions of black people being of the body, black people being strong but not being capable with the mind, these are the living relics of the ideas that were born in the age of slavery. We need black history, not just to remind us of contributions, though that work is absolutely vital and absolutely important. We need black history because within it are contained the blueprints of how these stereotypes that still operate in our society today, despite being centuries old, despite being the inventions of men who've been in their graves for centuries. History contains the blueprints of how these ideas were constructed. And a structural form of racism, like any structure, can, in theory, with hard work, be deconstructed. And that's what's really meant by anti-racism. as opposed to just being passively not racist. Anti-racism speaks to a verb. Anti-racism talks to the idea of racism, anti-racism being work, being a project that needs to be done. And if we take that idea, that our task, those of us, of all nations, of all nationalities and races, who strongly do not want to live in a society shaped by these old and toxic ideas, 3/4 of us, according to the last survey, do not regard ourselves as prejudiced. If we want to create the society that is shaped by people who do not want to be influenced by these ideas, we need to recognize what it is we're up against. Race is one of the most powerful, one of the most toxic, one of the most viral ideas ever created. It passed through our society for generation after generation, in popular culture, in intellectual culture. And it lives on, not just in our society, but in our own subconscious, whether we're black or whether we're white. Black History Month is valuable because it is about celebrating contributions, but it is also about reminding ourselves of the toxic ideas that have made the lives of black people so difficult, and reminding ourselves of something positive, that something that can be constructed, like the idea of race, can be deconstructed. But it will, I suspect, take a comparable and a commensurate amount of effort and resources and ingenuity to demolish the idea of race as it took to build it in the first place. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for giving me this platform to speak to you today.
And wonderful, David. Thank you so much for, again, a very insightful presentation, very thought-provoking presentation as well. Now, there we go. I think everyone's going to give you one of those electronic round of applause there. Fantastic.
Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, guys, and thanks for listening. And again, there's still one more poll question on the right-hand side. But what I want to do now is I'm going to hand over to Claire, and I'm going to move you to the stage, Claire. I'm going to join you there as well, okay? Here we go. Right. And you've got a number of questions. I'm going to check the chat window for some additional questions as well. Okay, but Claire, over to you. Your chance to kind of share with you some of the thoughts and the questions that you've taken. And again, over to you, Claire and David.
Thanks, Howard. And yeah, thanks, David. That was really...
There were books you really had to go out of your way to come into contact with. And Staying Power was very different. It was the work of a British journalist called Peter Fryer, who'd actually been at Tilbury on the day that the Windrush turned up. So it became a sort of life, a feature of his life, following the stories, following the travails of this community. And he wrote this enormous 1,000-word book called Staying Power in the early 80s. And I bought it when I was 16, and it was life-changing. It made me absolutely fascinated, absolutely committed to wanting to know more about this long trajectory, this long tradition that black and British people can be proud to have. We are part of a longer story. And when I was growing up, black and British was an identity that didn't really have a backstory. It wasn't seen as legitimate by many people. And so it was a story that was given life and given names and details through that book. It's still an astonishing book. It's in print. It's been reprinted. There's a new foreword by the journalist Gary Young. It remains an important book. And my book, Black and British: A Forgotten History, is a homage to that book.
Thank you. I think a few people will be sort of looking up books after this session. And from a sort of a business and an industry perspective, what do you think within business we can do to increase our knowledge around Black history, not obviously just during this month, but ongoing?
Well, I mean, I think it's, as I said, I think we need to be more embracing of Black History Month. I think it is an absolutely remarkable intervention. And, you know, I often hear people saying negative things about Black History Month. They'll say we should have a Black History every month of the year. Well, the problem with that argument is that we know that we do, because we know when people buy books. We've got data. We know when people access websites. And it's not just October. What happens in October is it's supercharged. It's one month of the year where it's the volume is turned up, if you like, on Black history. But people continue engaging with it, continue reading all the way through the year. So I do think we should not underestimate what it is for companies to celebrate Black History Month. It gives people and it gives employees a sense of legitimacy. here is this event that has the backing of leadership, has the backing of the corporate culture. So, I become a sort of bit of a apostle for Black History Month. I think we need to recognise and celebrate it much more. But, when I think about the past 3 years and the changes that have happened, the changes that we'd like to happen, it seems to me that the places where I've seen real change are places where, one fundamental thing has happened, and that's been those conversations. There's been deep, sometimes difficult, sometimes challenging and confrontational even conversations about race between groups of people who there'd almost been like a false truce of pretending it wasn't real, pretending it wasn't there. And I know a number of white people who I've spoken to have said how shocked they were to discover the experiences of their Black colleagues, that they just didn't realise what people had been through. We've been to one of those periods in history where the fast forward button's been pressed. Our society's willingness and capacity to discuss these issues, to enter into these debates, suddenly became enormously enhanced.
Thank you. And in terms of events in Black history, what's the one that's had the greatest influence on you, do you think?
Well, a lot of the work that I do is to show that Black history is there in the background, and that we can find Black people in all sorts of places in what we think of as mainstream British history. So the Black sailors at Trafalgar that were Black soldiers, not very many of them, but some of them at Waterloo. And a lot of the history that I find myself writing about and speaking about is about Black history in normal places, but in ways that we've often not thought about it. There's a pattern of thinking about Black history, which is from the American model, which I don't think works for Britain. We sometimes think that Black British history is only the history of Black people who came to Britain. Well, that doesn't really work for British history, because our history is imperial, colonial. The example I often use is the story of the Industrial Revolution. For the North, it's the centerpiece of what you're taught at school, the story of the Industrial Revolution. And what I was taught was what generations of British school children have been taught. And those inventions, those breakthrough inventions that we all remember from school, the flying shuttle, the spinning jenny, the water frame. What's interesting about the way they're taught, and interesting about those three innovations, is that all three of those innovations come from one industry, the cotton industry. And I was taught at school, and I know people 30 years younger than me who were taught exactly the same thing at school. I was taught a version of the Industrial Revolution that didn't explain where the raw cotton for the Industrial Revolution came from. The Economist magazine in 1850, of course the Economist still exists, estimated that 20% of the population, 1 in 5 people, was to some degree economically dependent on the cotton industry. It was Britain's biggest industry. It was our #1 export. And yet the raw cotton, at the heart of this, has no backstory. If you go to many of the working mills in Britain today, there's no backstory. It's as if it landed in those factories as if by magic. Well, that cotton was produced by 1.8 million enslaved people in America, in the Mississippi Valley. Now, they never set foot in Britain. They're not Black Britons in that sense, but their story is so intimately connected, so fundamental to the story of the Industrial Revolution, that to tell that history without their story is not just an omission, I think it is fundamentally dishonest. And I know people, as I said, much younger than me, who have had exactly that version of the Industrial Revolution taught to them at school very, very recently. So I think we should think about Black history as a series of missing chapters, of bits that we've edited out, of connections that have been broken and hidden away, rather than sort of major chapters of events. But to answer your question directly, I mean, the part of Black history which I find most interesting is the 18th century, when we have so much information about a remarkable Black population that was living in London at a time of slavery. It contains playboys, it contains people at the very bottom of society, it contains people who are literate, who are writing books, writing letters, it contains people who are abolitionists, Black abolitionists, long before William Wilberforce took to the stage. So that period, the 1760s and the 1770s, is what I really care about.
Okay, thank you. And just picking up your point around the history that's taught in schools, do you see that changing now? And if you don't see it changing now or improving, what do you think we can do as parents to supplement what they're not learning at school?
Well, I think it's good that you said that last line, because I think it is changing, but it's changing because of parents, because of teachers, because of governors. It's certainly not changing because of politicians. I think now is a moment in our history when, I think this week proves it, we shouldn't be looking to our leaders for leadership. They're playing culture war games with these big questions about the curriculum. And I think what we need to do is we need to support teachers, to give them the tools, give them the books, give them the lesson plans to try to teach this history in a holistic way. We know from a survey done, I think last year, that only 12% of teachers in British schools feel confident in teaching Black history. Well, we need to bolster that confidence with raw materials, with new books, new teaching plans. Because that's just not good enough. And it's very difficult to be a teacher as well. It's very difficult to be a teacher when you have pupils who expect their stories not to be part of the national story. To meet them before those expectations take over is really difficult, really challenging, but that's what we need to do.
Okay, thank you. Howard, before I continue, have we had any questions in the chat?
I think a lot of people are quite shy, but they are very, very moved by what you've said, David, and I think there's a lot to learn from what you've said today, and I think that people are raising eyebrows about some of the comments that you've made as well. I think one of the key things I wanted to ask as well. I think the theme of Black History Month is it's actions as opposed to words. What can we do, and what can we share with, I guess, today's society, especially the Black community, who may feel that they're still being left behind?
Well, it seems to me that when we think about the function of Black history, it's there to remind Black people that we have a long story, we have a tenure in this country, but it exists also because these are shared histories. And I think what that shared history tells me is that this task of confronting racism is wrapped up with a word that's become more part of debates in the past 3 years than ever before, which is the idea of allyship. That idea that black people themselves had to take on race, that it was the responsibility of Black people to confront these ideas. I think that idea is broken down and the idea of allyship has flowered and taken form. And I think in the corporate setting, that's a really fascinating place to be. Because if we don't want to live in a society that has these ideas swirling around, that has people's lives and life chances affected by these ideas, then we need to be actively anti-racist. We need to do something about it. It needs to be something that we all see as a collective task. And I think that idea of allyship is, I think, fundamental to the idea of action and to what companies and corporations can do, because it is possible, despite our best interests and best efforts, to create working environments and working cultures that are difficult and unattractive for people and minority groups to occupy and to navigate. And we have to ask that question about what is the role of DE&I. Is it only and strictly to open the doors of access to people who appear in a pipeline, who appear on the horizon, or is it to be more proactive? I was a few years ago at some of the historically Black universities in the United States, and one thing that really strikes you about those universities is the number of corporate logos attached to walls, attached to lesson plans, attached to modules that children are studying. Because, I shouldn't say children to students, so the young people are studying. They certainly don't like being called children. There is huge intervention. Those corporations are trying to find people at university, they're trying to find people at school. This idea of proactivity, that it's not just about who you can attract through your door, but you need to go finding people. I think that idea is gaining traction because of the way it's beginning to change the dial in the United States. It's a very strange thing about the US. It is in some ways the best and the worst country when it comes to race. If I was opening a Black-owned business, there's no place in the world I'd rather be than Atlanta, Georgia. There's few places in the world I'd less likely want to be if stopped by the police than rural Georgia. So America is the best and the worst.
Fantastic. Again, yeah, very informed answer as well, David. Thank you so much. I'm just going to quickly check to see if there are... we have a question. Brilliant. So, how do you convince people they are not selling out their race by being pro-anti-racist?
Sorry, could you repeat the question? Sorry.
Sure. Yeah. How do you convince people they are not selling out their race by being pro-anti-racist? Is that?
Well, I'm always concerned about these ideas about selling out, because I think it's one of those sort of phrases that it's often applied to people who are in very, very difficult political situations and who are trying to navigate them. I mean, to get power, you have to compromise with power. To get power, you need to get positions. And I look at the black politicians I know, who I know personally, and I see their dedication, but I also see the hostility that they receive from some members of the black community. And I'm sort of nervous about this idea that engaging with power, engaging with people you don't agree with, is selling out. Because the people I know who have to make political decisions and have to defend them, they're the people I knew long before they were politicians, and they're tough, and their heart is exactly where it always was. So I'm sort of nervous about that idea of selling out.
Yeah, it makes sense as well. Okay then, so we're 10 minutes to the top of the hour. We've heard from David. Claire, do you have any further comments or questions from your end?
I'm just checking to see if we've got one more question, actually. No, it's not a question. I think we've got plenty of comments, I think, both from the people that have been on the call and from myself as well. Just thank you so much. You've spoken so eloquently and informatively to all of us. And I think hopefully you've inspired anyone who wants to learn more to continue and to do some reading and to look at some of those books that you've mentioned as well. So thank you very much for your time.
Oh, well, thank you for having me, and thank you for celebrating Black History Month.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody. Again, look out. Over the next week, we'll be sending out one more exercise around Black History Month. We do value your contributions, so do, if requested, fill out the forms. There's going to be a quiz next week. We're going to have some prizes next week as well. But audience, thank you so much. David, thank you so much. A wonderful and insightful presentation. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you.